The message appeared without warning, and within minutes every major newsroom in the world was scrambling to confirm its meaning. Screens lit up across Washington, Tel Aviv, Brussels, and Riyadh as analysts replayed the words again and again. It was not a long speech, not a dramatic military announcement, and yet the implications sent a chill through diplomatic circles because the statement had come directly from Ali Khamenei, and buried inside the carefully measured language were three demands that, according to officials and observers, could determine whether the region moves toward war or pulls back from the edge. For hours before the message surfaced, tensions had already been building quietly in the background of global politics. Military alerts had been raised across parts of the Middle East. Intelligence agencies were tracking unusual movements of aircraft and naval forces. Diplomatic back channels were working overtime as governments tried to interpret a series of escalating signals that suggested the fragile balance in the region was beginning to crack. Then the statement arrived. It was delivered through official Iranian media, but the tone was unmistakably directed at a global audience. Speaking from Tehran, Khamenei framed the moment as a turning point in what he described as a confrontation between Iran and forces seeking to contain its influence. The language was deliberate, almost calm, but the underlying message carried a sharp edge. Iran, he declared, would not step back from what it considers its strategic rights unless three specific conditions were addressed. Within minutes of the speech ending, analysts across international security agencies were already debating what those conditions meant, because in moments of geopolitical tension, the difference between a demand and an ultimatum can be the difference between diplomacy and conflict. The first demand appeared to center on security guarantees. Iranian officials have long argued that their country faces constant military pressure from regional rivals and foreign powers. According to the statement, Iran expects concrete assurances that its territory will not be targeted by military operations designed to weaken its strategic capabilities. To outside observers, the phrasing immediately raised questions. In recent years, the Middle East has witnessed a series of covert confrontations involving cyber operations, airstrikes, and shadow conflicts between rival powers. None of those confrontations has ever been officially acknowledged in full detail, but the pattern is widely understood by security experts. By framing the demand as a matter of national defense, Khamenei was signaling that Iran views these operations as acts that could justify a larger response if they continue. The second demand appeared even more complex. It involved economic pressure. For more than a decade, Iran's economy has been shaped by layers of international sanctions tied to disputes over its nuclear program and regional activities. Those sanctions have affected everything from oil exports to banking systems, placing enormous strain on Iran's domestic economy. Khamenei's message suggested that any meaningful reduction in tensions would require relief from what he described as economic warfare. That phrase carries enormous political weight, because sanctions are not just financial tools. They are also instruments of geopolitical strategy used by powerful nations to influence the behavior of rivals without resorting to military force. Removing them is rarely a simple decision. Within moments of the speech, economic analysts began calculating the possible consequences of any shift in sanctions policy. Oil markets reacted nervously. Energy traders watched closely for signs that negotiations might reopen pathways for Iranian exports. The third demand was perhaps the most sensitive of all. It involved regional influence. Iran has built alliances and partnerships with various groups and governments across the Middle East over many years. Those relationships form part of what Iranian officials describe as a defensive network designed to deter external threats. But critics in several countries argue that the same network destabilizes the region and increases the risk of conflict. Khamenei's statement made it clear that Iran considers these alliances non-negotiable elements of its national security strategy. In other words, any attempt to force Iran to dismantle that network would likely be rejected outright. The implications of these three demands were immediately apparent to diplomats. Together, they formed a framework that could shape the next stage of negotiations between Iran and the international community. but they also created a narrow and potentially dangerous corridor for diplomacy, because satisfying all three conditions simultaneously would require political compromises from multiple governments, each facing its own domestic pressures. Inside government buildings across several continents, emergency meetings began almost immediately after the statement was broadcast. In Washington, national security advisors gathered to assess whether the message represented an opening for negotiation or a warning of further escalation. In Europe, diplomats discussed whether new mediation efforts might be necessary to prevent the situation from spiraling into a direct confrontation. In the Middle East, military planners were watching even more closely, because when demands are issued during a period of rising tension, they often carry an unspoken deadline. For ordinary citizens across the region, the news spread quickly through social media and television broadcasts. Many had lived through previous crises and understood how rapidly the situation could change if diplomacy failed. Markets fluctuated, airlines adjusted flight routes near sensitive airspace, energy companies monitored shipping lanes through the Persian Gulf, aware that even minor disruptions could send shockwaves through the global economy. Meanwhile, in Tehran, the leadership appeared calm. Officials framed the demands not as threats, but as conditions for stability. But seasoned observers know that in geopolitics, words often serve two purposes at once. They communicate intentions to allies, and they test the resolve of adversaries. Now the world was left to interpret which message had truly been sent, because behind the three demands outlined by Khamenei lies a much larger question that diplomats and generals alike are now trying to answer. Were these conditions the foundation for a new round of negotiations, or the final warning before a confrontation that no one in the region can fully control? Within hours of the statement leaving Tehran, the reaction across global capitals was immediate and intense. What initially sounded like a calculated political message from Ali Khamenei was now being dissected by diplomats, intelligence officials, and military planners across several continents. Because the three demands outlined in that speech were not simply rhetorical points. In the language of geopolitics, they functioned as signals, carefully constructed indicators of how far a country may be willing to go and under what conditions it might step back. In Washington, the response began quietly but urgently. National security advisors gathered behind closed doors to analyze the exact wording used in the message. Every phrase mattered. Every pause in the speech was replayed by analysts who specialize in reading strategic intent. The United States has spent decades managing a tense and often hostile relationship with Iran, and officials know that public statements from Tehran's leadership are rarely delivered without precise calculation. One immediate question dominated the discussion: were these demands meant to open negotiations, or were they designed to justify a future escalation? Across the Atlantic, European diplomats were asking a similar question. For years, Europe has tried to position itself as a mediator in disputes involving Iran's nuclear program and regional influence. Several governments had invested significant political capital in past agreements aimed at limiting tensions. Now those diplomats were trying to determine whether the message from Tehran represented an opportunity to revive dialogue or a signal that the window for diplomacy might be closing. In the Middle East itself, the reaction was far more urgent. Military officials across several countries immediately raised alert levels, not because a direct attack had been announced, but because the conditions described by Khamenei touched on some of the most sensitive issues in the region. Iran's security concerns, its economic isolation, and its network of regional alliances are all deeply intertwined with ongoing rivalries that stretch from the Persian Gulf to the eastern Mediterranean. One country watching the situation particularly closely was Israel. For years, Israeli leaders have warned that Iran's expanding regional influence poses a strategic threat to their national security. The two countries have never fought a full-scale conventional war, but their rivalry has played out through covert operations, cyber conflicts, and proxy confrontations across multiple regions. When Khamenei's speech referenced security guarantees and regional alliances, Israeli defense analysts immediately began discussing what those statements might imply for future confrontations. Inside military headquarters in Tel Aviv, intelligence officers began reviewing recent developments in the region. Satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and reports from allied agencies were analyzed to determine whether Iran was preparing any moves that might accompany the political message. So far, there was no evidence of an imminent large scale military action. But the uncertainty itself was enough to trigger concern. Meanwhile, in the energy markets, traders were reacting to the possibility that rising tensions could affect global oil supplies. Iran sits along the northern coast of the Persian Gulf, one of the most strategically important energy corridors in the world. Any disruption to shipping routes through that region could send shockwaves through international markets. Within hours of the speech, oil prices began fluctuating as investors tried to assess the likelihood of further escalation. Energy companies were particularly focused on the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply passes every day. Iran has previously warned that if its economic lifelines are cut off, it could respond by challenging the flow of energy through that corridor. Even the suggestion of such a scenario is enough to trigger alarm in global markets. At the same time, political leaders in neighboring countries were trying to manage public perception. Governments across the region understand that sudden surges in geopolitical tension can create fear among populations already living with economic uncertainty and political instability. Television networks across the Middle East began hosting emergency discussions featuring retired generals, policy experts, and regional analysts. Viewers watched as experts debated whether Iran's demands represented a defensive posture or an aggressive strategic maneuver. Some commentators argued that Tehran was attempting to shift the narrative of the conflict. By framing its demands around security guarantees and economic relief, Iran could present itself as responding to pressure rather than initiating confrontation. Others disagreed. They argued that issuing demands during a period of rising tension can sometimes serve as a way of establishing political justification for future actions. In international politics, leaders often frame their next moves as responses to unmet conditions. This debate was unfolding not only on television screens, but also inside diplomatic back channels. Quiet messages were already being exchanged between governments trying to prevent the situation from escalating further. Experienced negotiators understand that even the most dramatic public statements are often followed by private discussions aimed at clarifying intentions. But the difficulty in this situation lies in the complexity of the demands themselves. Security guarantees require trust between adversaries who have spent decades viewing each other with suspicion. Economic sanctions involve international legal frameworks and political decisions that extend far beyond bilateral negotiations. Regional alliances touch on the interests of multiple governments and armed groups operating across different countries. Each demand alone would be difficult to resolve. Together they create a diplomatic puzzle with enormous stakes, and that is why the world's attention has now shifted toward what happens next. Because when powerful leaders present conditions during moments of geopolitical tension, the international community must decide how to respond, whether to engage, to resist, or to attempt some delicate balance between the two. For now, no country has publicly accepted or rejected the demands, but behind closed doors, the calculations have already begun. Military planners are studying worst-case scenarios. Diplomats are searching for openings that might keep negotiations alive. And intelligence agencies are watching every movement across the region, aware that sometimes the most important signals appear not in speeches, but in the quiet actions that follow them. The world is now waiting to see whether the three demands announced in Tehran will become the foundation of tense negotiations or the starting point of a crisis that could reshape the balance of power in the Middle East. As the hours turned into days after the message from Tehran, the geopolitical atmosphere grew heavier, almost electric. Diplomats spoke cautiously in public, but privately the language became more urgent. Intelligence briefings in Washington, Brussels, and across the Middle East were no longer simply analyzing the three demands issued by Ali Khamenei. They were now asking a more troubling question: what happens if those demands are ignored? because in the modern geopolitical landscape, demands issued at moments of tension often carry consequences that are not immediately visible. They create pressure points, forcing governments to respond in ways that reveal their true strategic priorities. Inside the Pentagon, analysts began mapping possible scenarios if negotiations failed to materialize. Military planners reviewed the complex web of alliances and rivalries stretching across the Middle East. For decades, the region has been shaped by overlapping conflicts, where direct war between major powers is rare, but indirect confrontations occur regularly through proxies, intelligence operations, and strategic deterrence. The danger now was that the balance holding those confrontations in check might begin to weaken. One of the central concerns revolved around the network of regional alliances that Iran has built over many years. From the perspective of Tehran, these relationships are essential to its security strategy. But from the perspective of its rivals, the same network is often viewed as an expanding sphere of influence that threatens the stability of neighboring states. Among the countries watching most closely was Israel. Israeli security officials have repeatedly warned that Iran's strategic reach across the region poses what they describe as an existential challenge. Over the past decade, tensions between the two sides have intensified through a series of shadow confrontations. Airstrikes, cyber operations, and intelligence missions have taken place in the background of the larger political conflict, rarely acknowledged publicly, but widely understood by experts who follow the region. Now, those experts were examining whether the demands issued by Khamenei might signal the next phase of that confrontation. If Iran believes its conditions are being dismissed, some analysts argue it could choose to demonstrate its leverage through controlled escalation. That might involve increased military activity through allied groups in different parts of the region, or a more assertive posture in strategic waterways like the Persian Gulf. Even small moves in such sensitive areas can carry enormous consequences. The Persian Gulf remains one of the most critical corridors for global energy supplies. Tankers carrying millions of barrels of oil pass through its waters every day. Any disruption, even temporary, could ripple across the global economy within hours. Energy markets were already reacting to the uncertainty. Traders watched shipping patterns closely, monitoring reports from maritime security agencies. Insurance rates for vessels operating in the region began creeping upward as companies calculated the risks of operating in increasingly tense waters. At the same time, governments across Europe were quietly stepping up diplomatic efforts. Several European states have historically attempted to mediate disputes involving Iran, particularly when tensions revolve around economic sanctions and nuclear policy. Behind closed doors, European diplomats were exploring whether informal channels could open a path toward dialogue before the situation hardened into open confrontation. But diplomacy in moments like this moves slowly, and the political pressures facing each government complicate every step. In Washington, policymakers must weigh the domestic political consequences of any decision involving Iran. Years of conflict and mistrust have created a political environment where concessions are viewed with skepticism by many voters and lawmakers. In Tehran, the leadership faces its own internal pressures. Economic hardship caused by sanctions has created frustration among parts of the population, while political leaders remain determined to project strength on the international stage. Any appearance of backing down under pressure could be interpreted domestically as weakness. This dynamic creates a dangerous cycle. When both sides feel compelled to demonstrate resolve, the room for compromise becomes smaller. Meanwhile, international media has amplified the sense of crisis. News networks around the world began running continuous coverage of the standoff, analyzing every development in real time. Headlines speculated about the possibility of regional escalation, while commentators debated whether the demands issued by Khamenei represented a strategic gambit or a genuine attempt to force negotiations. Social media added another layer of intensity. Clips of the speech circulated widely online, often stripped of context and interpreted through political narratives from different sides of the conflict. In an era where information spreads instantly, public perception can sometimes escalate tensions even faster than diplomatic actions. Yet beneath all the speculation, one reality remained clear to those studying the situation closely. The three demands outlined by Iran have effectively created a strategic crossroads. If diplomatic channels succeed in transforming those demands into a framework for negotiation, the crisis could evolve into a new round of talks aimed at stabilizing the region. But if the demands are dismissed or ignored entirely, the leadership in Tehran may feel compelled to demonstrate that its warnings were not merely symbolic, and that is the uncertainty now hanging over the Middle East. Military forces remain on alert. Diplomats continue their quiet negotiations. Markets watch every signal for signs of escalation, and ordinary people across the region follow the news with growing concern, aware that decisions made in distant government buildings could shape their future in ways they cannot control. Because history has shown that wars rarely begin with a single dramatic moment. More often, they begin with a series of warnings, demands, and missed opportunities. And as the world now studies the three conditions delivered from Tehran, the question echoing through capitals across the globe is becoming impossible to ignore. Are these demands the opening move in a new negotiation, or the final signal before the fragile balance in the Middle East begins to break?